Hi everyone, and welcome to part one of the second week of YouTube tutorials coming out for our 3D modeling class. This week we'll be discussing more about inorganic modeling and how to develop prototype models at a quick pace and using splines and shapes tools, learning more about new tools to add in more edges and more detail called Swift Loop. And we're going to be developing a few different assignments throughout this week that will allow you to expand your knowledge about developing inorganic objects that are good for not only sci-fi but for weapons and environments, sceneries, all that kind of stuff. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to introduce you to is a little something called shapes and splines. Once we are in 3D Studio Max, we know our basic layout now. We're very comfortable with it, I hope. I'm going to just make sure my viewports are a little bit bigger here. We're going to go to our Create panel. We know that we're working, and we've currently been working in our Geometry panel. We're going to move over and we're going to go to the Shapes panel. Now, shapes allow you to create different shapes inside 3D Studio Max using 2D objects, but they also allow you to do a whole bunch of cool things that might help you with your 3D modeling, creating a few different types of objects. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that. Basically, when you open the Shapes menu, we currently are working in splines, but you can also change to NURB curves, extended splines, CFDs, and max creation graphs. But really, where I'm going to focus most of my attention is actually the spline menu. As you can see, we have different 2D shapes that we can create. We have the basic line tool, circle, of which I have left click and drag. It creates circles. Like that. Same with arcs. You left click and drag, and then you left click again to create the arc. N-gons will create shapes with different amount of sides, and you can always change the parameters. Just like everything else in 3D Studio Max, once you create it, just like in the geometry menu, it creates a shape, and you can see here we have N-gon, we have circle, and it has parameters down at the bottom, including rendering and what's called interpolation. So let's go through a little bit of detail, and I'm going to show you first the line tool. The line tool works like drawing in vectors in Photoshop or any other program. Normally, I always suggest that you use a front left top view to work with your line tool. Never do it in perspective because you're going to get the angles wrong of what you're trying to draw. So if you want to work in the front view, for instance, let's say you want to make a quick prototype of a sword. You're developing a video game. Let's say your lead programmer is like, we need a giant sword in the game ASAP, at least a prototype, so we have a certain size to work with. Well, you can just grab the line tool, and you left click once to start the drawing. You can see it starts the drawing, and I just left click, like tap left click, and now I can move my mouse around, and you can see that I get this line that follows. Now I can left click again, and it creates the next vertex point or line segment, and then I can left click again, and I can keep going on and on like that. Just like in Photoshop, you can hold shift to perform perfect 90-degree angles. So I can just do this, do that. Create a sword any way you want. I just create a little edge there for some style, extra style points. So once you left click and you tap the yellow point, you can see here it wants to close the spline. And we get our final object here. So I was drawing in the front view, so if I rotate my perspective view, you can see the sword here. Now there's a few things we can do with this. Currently, if I go to my parameters menu, since we drew with the line tool here, we are able to go to our rendering panel, just expand that panel open, and you can see we have enable in renderer and enable in viewport. And you'll see what happens is it actually creates a shape. So we actually created an outline to a shape. And right now, below in our rendering panel, you see it's set to radial, and there's a thickness that we can change. There's the amount of sides we can change, the angle. So we can change a whole bunch of stuff like that. Sorry, I'm just going to close that. So we can change a whole bunch of things really quick like this, or we can change it to rectangular. Now rectangular gives it length, width, and an angle, and you can see that we can actually create a whole bunch of shapes using this. So if I change the length here, there you go. So that's good for creating outlines. And you can also change what's called the interpolation to make it smoother or less smoother or less smooth by changing off optimize mode. And you can see now if I turn off optimize, we get a whole bunch of polygon counts here. Polygons created, and if I go to optimize, it actually reduces the amount of polygons in that model. I'm going to full screen this for a second. But what I want to do is make basically a prototype version of this. So I'm going to turn off these renderers. And we just have our flat 2D line shape here. What you can do is you can right click on this object and convert to editable poly. You'll notice what happens is I get one big flat polygon. So it's like a plane. What I created was just a plane, and you can see that these polygons are completely flipped here. This is non-renderable, this is renderable, right? But the one thing we notice is like during a plane doesn't have a thickness to it, right? So we can extrude that thickness. So if I go to extrude, left click there, I can just extrude it. And now we have a little prototype sword. If you want to go in a bit more detail, you can draw out the handle separately, you can draw out the guard separately, and the blade separately, and you can prototype in an entire object altogether. Now that we extruded it, you're going to notice also that this side, actually, there is no side to it. We extruded it, and it went inwards. But you can just hold Shift while selecting a polygon. This is all considered one polygon. We don't have to worry about the poly flow right now. This is a prototype model only, a placeholder. I can hold Shift and move these polygons. And it works like copying a model. Same thing applies to copying a polygon. It's going to ask you if you want to copy it to a new object or a new element. I'm going to say new element. And there we go. So the next step afterwards is you notice that even though there's polygons here, we're looking at the black side of them. We're looking at the wrong side of them. Well, since we're in editable poly and polygon mode, we can click on this poly, which is all black side, wrong side facing, and flip it. So we go down our menu to edit polygons, and we click flip. There we go. So now we have our full prototype sword, or placeholder sword. We just need to weld those vertices together. Because those new vertices we made on this side, you can see they're still just hanging around. If you want a quick way to weld a whole bunch of vertices that you know are really close together, select all the vertices in your model, go to weld options, and turn the number just slightly higher than normal. And you could see I went from 45 before, after 30, I push apply and continue, and all the vertices that I have that are really, really close are all welded together. And I can tell just by the number increase, like how far apart the other vertices are, that all the vertices I wanted welded are now welded. And now I have at least a prototype sword. So what you want to do with a prototype sword to get your final sword model, let's say we put this into a game engine or we put it into our character's hands and we were pretty content with the size, the shape. Even though it's a prototype model, you can still go to the front view. And since this originally was a drawing that we made, every vertex point that we drew, that we left clicked on, we can modify those, just as easy. I'm going to use a scale tool here to make sure everything's even. Like this. I'm going to use the scale tool here to make sure the handle and guard are the same size. And you see now if I go back to my perspective view, see now we have a good prototype handle, and we can do our final adjustments here, and that's all good. So what you want to do is turn this into a 3D reference. And what I mean by 3D reference is I showed you how to set up image planes before, how to import an image and put it on an image plane. Basically, what you want with this is to kind of use it as a 3D reference. To do that, you use a shortcut key, Alt-X on your keyboard. So I hold this model and I push Alt-X. And that makes it see-through. So that means I can start developing the other sword, the final model, right beside it or even inside it. Place it inside, and now I get the exact size and dimensions of the model that's being used in the game, or the size was correct. Our director said that size works really well, model that, then we have that there perfectly. Then the next step you want to do is freeze it. And you can either freeze it by going into your scene and layer managers here and clicking the freeze icon, or you can right click on the object and freeze it. So I want you to practice a couple times using the line tool, just left clicking and drawing, just little points like that. Let's go to the front view. So you can see I can just quickly pop out a gun if I want to. I can left click, left click, left click, left click. Hold shift and I can get exact diameters. Close the spline. Convert to, edit poly. So now we're going to run into two things that we want to discuss. One, how do I make curves with the line tool? And two, how do I draw a hole inside something I'm going to turn into a prototype object? Well, it's actually not that hard. So we're going to go to our line tool again. We go to our create panel. We go to our shapes panel. We go to line. To create a curved line, we just left click and hold the mouse while moving it. So left click and hold the button, then move your mouse. Left click and hold the button, move your mouse. Left click, hold the button, move the mouse. Left click, hold the button. And it creates these arches. And we can close this spline like that. So before you do anything else, before we do the right click and convert to edit poly, we can actually edit this line tool as much as we want as well using the vertex, segment, and spline. They're a little different than vertex, edge, and poly, but they kind of work pretty much the same. With vertex, if you have the curve tool enabled, you're going to notice you have these lines right here, which represent how to change our curve. We can shrink them and move them. We can even rotate these vertexes, and it alters the shape of our line. Now, the one thing you might start noticing when you alter the points on these lines, you order these and you change these curves, you change this, you move this around. Let's say I rotate this point. See, we can get any type of shape we want out of this, right? It's a really handy tool. I must admit, left clicking and dragging makes everything look really nice. Now, like I said, the one thing you're going to notice is that the curve isn't so soft, right? If you're working in a really high polygon model, and I'm going to turn on enable a renderer and enable in viewport so you can see it, that looks pretty good for low poly, right? We get a pretty good model there. I can go to vertex and still manipulate everything. I'm going to rotate it so it looks a little bit better here. There we go. Something like that. But it's still pretty low poly. Now, I'm going to change this interpolation mode, and that's how we're going to get more polys out of our model. Currently, it's on optimize with 6 steps. If we change the steps amount, you'll notice the polygon count increase, which is great. But it's not really fully optimized the way we want. What you want most of the time, especially if you're going to do movie rendering, is adaptive. What adaptive does is it puts polygons in the right place and the right curves so that everything looks smooth. And you're going to notice this shape. Now look at that. Look how smooth that is everywhere, right? So, like, and if we look at our line, that looks better already. So interpolation is what does that. You see on optimize or 7 steps, even without optimize on, we have these jagged lines, but switching it to adaptive, which adapts to the curving of your object. Look how smooth that line is. And to test it out, you can just enable and render, enable and viewport like that. So if you wanted an actual object, we've been playing with this, converting our line tool into edit poly and getting flat shapes. But if you actually want to use this for a 3D model and create wraps on your sword handles, or let's say some rope or a belt or something like that, you can definitely do it by clicking enable and renderer or enable and viewport, and then right clicking on our model, convert to edit poly, and now it's a polygon model that we can edit with our vertex, edge, polygon tools, all those tools we have. So this creates a nice simple way to create straps, cords, shoelaces, that kind of stuff. Because don't forget, not only do we have this nice way of doing it rectangular, we can make this shape radial too. So we get this nice, shape circular around, and we can increase the amount of sides. So if I create 12 sides, look how smooth it is. It can be a shoelace, it can be straw, it can be, it could be a billion different things that you can imagine that you could do. A grappling hook line, that kind of stuff. So the line tool can do quite a bit. I'm just going to reset my scene here a little bit and put this all back to normal, front, top, left, and perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a gun. Let's draw this gun again, like this, like that. Let's make it a sci-fi gun. Big barrel in the front. And remember, this is just for prototyping, right? So I get guard right there. So enable and render and enable viewport we're on. So I got that shape around it. Sorry, let's undo that for a second. So I can see the shape quite clearly. I'm going to turn these off though. And hopefully, there you go. Turn these off and I get my line tool here. I'll make it a little bit more clear for you guys. There you go, nice and pink. So we have this as my gun. But let's say Right, we have our gun, but we know for a fact that there needs to be a hole here for the trigger, and there maybe needs to be a few holes around this gun right here that are poking through. Well, then we're going to create those. Now, we're going to, as you can tell, or hopefully you did see, there was a weird blue shape here right above line and rectangle. It said start new shape. And the arrow is always clicked on until you click it off. Basically, that means every time you create a new line or a new circle, it's a new geometry mesh, it's a new line tool. But if we click this off, every time we create a new object now, it will be merged with these objects. So basically, we have our big object that I created, and now I'm going to create the opening and close that spline. What happens is this is all one object now. Because I turned off start new shape, it managed to create one shape. And if I convert it to editable poly, see what happens is it actually created that hole here for us. So if I back up one step, I'm going to back up a couple steps here, go back to edit spline. I can keep adding. I have to select it first. And then I'm going to go to my line tool when start new shape is clicked off. And then I'm going to create, like little holes here, maybe. Close that spline. Yeah, I'll close this spline here. And now I get this type of shape. And you can do all your edits you need before you even convert it. So if I needed to change the vertexes, if I needed to change a whole segment, let's say I need to make this a little bit tighter, pull this back a little bit, maybe rotate this one. You can do all that. Splines grab entire spline objects. It's like taking elements. So because we created multiple splines, clicking the spline tool will allow us to select those individual components. So our next step now is we can convert it to an edit poly. And we can now extrude this and do whatever we'd like with it as well. Don't forget, after you extrude, I can go edit poly, polygon mode. I'm going to go to extrude. So now I get my weird sci-fi gun thing going on. I'm going to copy this side of the face over to the other side just by holding shift and using the move tool. Clone the element. I'm going to flip it. And then I'm going to weld it as a last step. Make sure everything welds together. Make sure my numbers change enough, like before 84, after 56. Sounds like a good weld to me. It looks good. And normally, if you could tell a weld is really successful, if you go to element mode and click on the object, if the whole object is selected, that means it's welded pretty accurately, so everything is together. So that looks good. And maybe the next step I want to do is take this shape, and I'm going to give it a bit of depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to polygon. I'm going to grab this entire side. I'm going to extrude it one more time. So now there's a line down the middle of my gun. So even though I'm creating a small prototype, I'm getting a lot more detail now. And don't forget, we also have the other tools we can still use as well. Things like slice plane. And then I can cut across the model. I did a couple slices there just like that. And now I can grab these. And since this is going to be a sci-fi gun, maybe I'm just going to pop this like that. Scale these so they're all flat. Scale this so it's all flat. See, so even working from a base and this slicing up new shapes, this is called freeform modeling, what we're doing. And it's basically just a way of we're just drawing with shapes right now, and we're not creating our final model. We're creating a prototype model where we're trying to get the basic look of what maybe our final model will look like in the end. So if I go to inset here, maybe I want to do the inset back here too, and I increase that number. So I'm going to create a hole in my mesh right there using the inset tool. But now I have empty hole, and now there's no polygons connecting these two. So that means these are borders now. So you see if I click on that border, and I click on the border behind it holding control, I've selected both borders. I'm going to go to my bridge tool, And I'm going to create a bridge between those empty borders. And now I have like this empty slot in the front of my gun. So now if I wanted to put a barrel in here, then I can do that if I really want to. Just adding these little details and just thinking outside the box while you're creating this shape is an easy way for you to prototype a model or gun or anything you want, really. I can add a new line slice plane tool between these right here just by grabbing this like that. I go to my slice plane tool. Just going to rotate that a bit. Click slice. There you go. I get a nice already looped version of these polygons. And you can see just by adding those, all right, things are looking a little bit better already. And just go into detail as much as you can. This is a great way to build prototypes. Don't forget things like, especially if you're building a gun, because it's a prototype, you shouldn't slack off in creating that extra detail that companies will like to see when you're building a prototype. There's a hole for the clip to go into, so they know that a clip needs to go in this gun. Maybe we need, let's see, we need a hammer back here. So maybe I'll go to inset, and I'm going to push this in. And then I'm going to create another inset, extrude, and then only extrude the top part. See, and now we get a little hammer back there, which we can, twist a little bit. And it adds that depth. You're adding nothing but depth. And because we have a split down the middle, and the reason why I like creating the split down the middle is I can delete half this gun and mirror it. So really, you don't have to work on both sides of the detail. We can delete half the gun right now. See, like that. And I can use tools, mirror, like I taught you guys in the first week, tools, mirror, make sure it's on the right axis, and make it a reference. And now I'm going to move it into place. Now anything I alter to one side will happen to the other. And because I have these vertices down the middle, it also means if I expand, let's say these top vertices up a little bit, I already created a softer look to my gun just by slightly lifting these polygons. And I can do the same thing for all around my gun. My my handle's going to need a lot more detail here, so I know that I'm going to have to start editing this and changing things around. And this is what's called the prototyping phase. So, and this is just using a line tool, right? I didn't even have to model anything. The edge loops are not great. The polygon count's all weird, but really we're just making a placeholder for our final gun, because when we're freeform modeling like this and we go to our final step, we may actually just render these in Photoshop and draw on top of it. If you're drawing a comic book or something like that, this is the perfect way to create an object, render it out, and draw on top of it in Photoshop and use it any way you want. Like if you need like a good angle shot of a gun like this, then just render it out and put it in your character's hand or something like that. And then you got a good model that you can use. Don't be afraid to think outside the box when it comes to 3D modeling. Although there is an accurate way to model using the edge loops that I will teach you and we'll go through, this is actually great for creating prototype models that are good for many, many uses. And things that aren't animated in 3D Studio Max, often or not, the polygon counts don't matter too much, or at least, sorry, the polygon layout until the final model that needs to be used and or animated. So you can play around a lot and create a whole bunch of different objects like this just using the line tool. So we'll go over that one more time. Because we have the line tool, we also have other tools like circle and rectangle, and they all do different things. I'm going to create a quick chain link. So I'm going to take the rectangle one, and I'm going to look at the parameters for this. So I'm going to create a rectangle shape, automatic rectangle, and I can choose enable and render and enable and viewport here, and I get this shape. Now I can change this radial. I can choose the amount of sides. I can choose the thickness, the angle, anything like that. I can also go to rectangular mode. If I wanted to create a window or a belt buckle or something like that really quick, why not just go to the rectangular tool? Instead of getting a polygon, extruding it all the time, I can just literally pick a rectangle and it creates a shape for me. I can then convert it to an edit poly and that's it. Away I go, right? No issues. And I can change the interpolation type if I need to, not optimize it so I get more polys. And then I can change the amount of steps if I really want more, as long as they work with the rest. So now I get this nice shape that has lots of edges that I can use and I can extrude from, which might work great for exactly what I need. However, maybe we need to change the shape a bit more. I'll keep enable and render, enable viewport on, and I'll put it on optimize. And if I look down the list of, I got my rendering options, I got my interpolation, which is the normal stuff, but there's also parameters for the actual box itself, the rectangle shape. We have length, width, so we can change these as much as we want, of course. And we also have corner radius. Now you can see in corner radius, we actually get a nice soft looking object like this. And this could be used for a ton of things. Like, we got chain links, so I can actually just copy this. Holding shift and rotate, I simply just started to make a copy. So if I need to make chains, then I can just copy this over and over again. Copy this. Whoops. Copy this like that. See, now I got a small chain link. Render that out. Look how good that looks already. You can use that for tons of different uses. Don't be afraid to scale, move, and rotate and do that. And that's what's great about the shapes tool, is playing around with just splines and just drawing out your imagination. It really works. It takes everything to a whole new level. So if we go to, we'll reset this here. And don't be afraid to play around, not only with text in Text Plus, which is in the Create Geometry menu, we also have text here that we're able to use as well. So if you have something to write in your scene that you need to say or say to anybody, you can just basically, change the angle here, turn this enable renderer off, and you can type in like, this is my first model. So if you want to write notes to me, your teacher, or somebody else who you're working with, and you send them a 3D model in a Max scene, don't be afraid to create a new layer, put some text in it, and actually have notes about what they're looking at. Maybe something, they have a holster on their leg, and you're like, this is holster one. Oh, sorry, I wrote a name in color. This is a text holster. And then when I go to the modify parameters, then I'm going to go right. This is holster one, or just type holster one. Holds main gun, reaches for it with right arm, made out of leather. And other notes like that that might be important to the animator or important to somebody who's helping you out with textures, or maybe someone who's helping you out modeling it. Sometimes models go from one modeler to the other, and these little notes may help someone. So for instance, you students have sent me your models last week. It's one thing, you can put notes in your models if you need for me to look at something in particular. Maybe you have an issue with one section of your model, write a note beside it, keep a layer called notes, and write little notes all over your scene. And then I can just zoom in on that note and be like, okay, maybe they had a problem figuring out what this vertex did. And then I can zoom in specifically on that, and that will help out. That's just another way how the splines tool can help out there. So just to reiterate one more time, you can create tools here by using splines here by clicking on any of these. Try it, test them out. They're gonna come in really handy when it comes to prototyping your models and building out scenes. And don't forget that if you want something to be multiple shapes, so I drew my gun out. I just draw a simple gun shape like that. And if you want to create holes inside that 3D model, always draw the main object first, turn off, start new shape, then draw what would go on the inside. So draw the holes. So always main object first, then the holes, and then we can convert it to an editable poly. And then you get that. And then remember, we have to extrude, copy one side to the other side, and then we're all good to go. If you want to make it a little easier, convert it to edit poly. The best thing to do is polygon, extrude, and then you can literally just mirror this and you'll be fine from the start. So I just grab that, I just extrude it, I go right to mirror, I mirror a reference, and there you go. Already set up for me. Everything's all good. I just have to change how thick my vertexes are. And then I have something I can work with. Then I can slice plane and do everything else I need. If I have to make a suggestion before you even convert to edit poly, is let's go back a few steps. When you're at editable spline like here, I would always suggest to turn off adaptive and leave optimize off as well, and then just keep it the way you draw it and you'll be fine. So that's just a little bit about shapes. What I want you to do is just practice a few times, draw a whole bunch of different prototype models. If you want to draw them in pieces, draw them in pieces. If you want to draw a gun, then a gun clip and a gun attachment, do so and work from that to create what's called prototype placeholder models. That's a good thing to practice for the next day. And then we're going to take another step and we're going to start building furniture by using new tools, like the basic tools we learned so far, and adding in a couple of new tools because we're going to start building those inorganic objects and start building out a scene from that. So good luck with learning the spline tools. Play around with the text, play around with the line tools, create a whole bunch of different shapes. You can create chain links. Don't forget there's arcs as well. We can use these. Don't forget the enable and render and enable and viewport settings. We can create a whole bunch of cool shapes using this, and they all have obviously different parameters we can play with, like radius here. We can create nice curves here, create pie slices. See this? You can create like a animated Pac-Man in 3D, just like instant. Two right there. Reverse it. All that kind of stuff. It's like it's crazy the amount of parameters that are just instantly visible that sometimes people don't realize it's there to access. Because we can create tons of different cool stuff. For instance, some of you are creating different sword handles and going a bit crazy with that. Well, here's how you'd create a grip for the sword handle as a last quick example of how to use this spline tools to your advantage. I'm going to click on Helix, and I just created the basic Helix object. So I'm going to do this, left click like that. Okay, I'm going to turn off enable and render right now, and I get this little helix object right here. So I can play around with the radiuses. Let's say something that looks like a circle in the top view, so I know it's going to surround everything. Change the height, and I'm going to change the amount of turns. Check that out. I can change the bias too. If it's more at the top, more at the bottom. If it looks more like a spring, a slinky type shape, you can change that. So, and then I'm going to turn on enable and renderer. Just enables if you're going to render the actual object. I always turn on both these at the same time, enable and renderer and enable and viewport. And if I change the parameters for this, and maybe change the angle a bit, we get this nice like wrap type shape, and we can start altering that as well. You know, change the bias. Go sorry, to our modify panel. See this? I can change this. Take away the bias, so it's all kind of evened out here. Change the amount of turns, maybe something more like this. I can change it to radial if I really want to. Create a nice spring shape there. But really, maybe I just want to create more of a wrap shape like this. And you can try and change this as much as you want until it fits your needs. You can just go crazy with it and add a lot of detail. There's also a lot of extra spline. You know, you have nerves, curves, but basically focus on the spline. Try and play around with these. Try and play around with the n-gon as well. N-gon creates a basic shape here, but we can change the amount of sides it has. You know, to create all kinds of different shapes, and we can extrude from there and be fine. So we're going to focus on a type of vehicle coming up next, which might be really fun for you guys who like to over stylize stuff, some furniture, and we're going to create a lot of inorganic shapes of all sorts. So play around with the shapes a lot, and play around with shapes to actually add on to the models you had from last week, or just create entirely new models using shapes. Try and think of something creative to come up with. Some people have done lightsabers with the line tool, make a prototype gun, a prototype car, prototype anything you want, just using these basic shapes. And you might find that it comes a lot easier when you're able to actually draw out the shapes and just extrude them. It comes together really, really fast. So good luck with that. We're going to move on to the next lesson coming up.